While we wait, first question, who is from Finland? Anybody? Oh my God, we have seriously more Finnish people here than ever before. Even in this room, maybe there are others in other rooms. This is good because you know then how to read this book. Roni Mitra from CA tried to read it this morning and failed, but he could read the API word. This is the same word in Finnish. But more about that book in this presentation, which is about APIOps cycles. And what is it, why is it useful, and actually how does it solve your problems that you might think you have after the previous presentation. So there were a lot of design issues there. And if you didn't take notes or record the presentation, you might have forgotten all of that already, what you should be doing, and that's why the method is good. But who am I? I'm a trainer, consultant, architect, and I was co-writing this book. And why did we write the book? Because you guys, we have a problem. This is a picture from 2016 from a research made using programmable web and the listings there for APIs. And the problem is that the APIs seem to be centered there where the red arrows are, or like rather the round circles are. And in the Nordics there, we have a few dots. And the situation was even worse, and still is to some extent, whereas in Finland, the government actually was so worried about the state of API economy and platform economy in Finland that they said that these are our key things for the coming years, platform economy and AI. Finland needs to be the best in those. So I don't know where you guys in Sweden are now, but based on the Nordic APIs visits earlier that I have made, you guys have been about maybe 2 years before us in Finland, but now we are running fast, so be aware. But hey, less about Finland and more about people. Like in the previous presentation, people are extremely important. And actually, one of my customers said in a workshop that now he finally understands that API is actually short for all people are important. Because you can't do APIs, you can't use APIs, buy them or sell them unless you have all of those people involved in the process. The problem is, of course, that most API conferences and most API literature and guidelines and everything else is targeted for 1 or 2 or 3 of those persons there, at least not for the marketing or customer experience or business or something else. Luckily, that is something that we want to change. So about 1.5 years ago, I was working in Digia, and I had gone there from Kesko. You might know Kesko from K-Rauta, which is also in Sweden, and in some other countries. And we had a problem that we had 2 teams, and the management of the company had said that this company needs to become the global digitalization guru company, best in the world style. And we had 2 small teams doing APIs. And that didn't seem really possible. So what we did was scale to 30 people, or 30 teams doing APIs in 6 months. And then people started asking me and the teams that, how did you do this? How can we do this? I mean, we had people from 15 different companies working with the APIs, different teams in different countries, Russia, Sweden, Finland, a lot of other places. And I said, I have no clue. I have seriously no clue. I mean, we were doing these certain things, and we were doing design guidelines, and we were doing a lot of things that were mentioned previously, but I had no idea how to replicate that process to anybody else. So I was asked to train people, and then I kind of went in and talked with the team, and we came up with this APIOps cycles method that is combining a lot of things. It's combining API business model canvases, value proposition canvases, technical architecture, information architecture, and design guidelines. But it's a method. It's just not separate tools. And it was actually pretty useful because the problem is that in API development, you need to hit the wall as fast as you can. Basically, you have to find out as fast as possible the problems that you're going to face with the API that you're going to design and develop. And in a real-world situation, the top one is what actually happened in one project. It was basically a 6-month project, and after the first 5 months, there was this oh shit moment where there was a lot of code, a lot of APIs, and then there were actually some companies, some partner companies starting to use those APIs, and they found out that they can't use them, or some of them can't use them, because they were expecting XML post or whatever. There were different things that they were expecting and different features they were expecting, and nobody had shown them anything because the business and the IT were not in connection there. And of course, that was 5 months wasted and the project was delayed. So how do you do this in a proper way? Is that you have like the first sprint of the 6-month project, for example, and you have the APIOps cycles methods used there. You have a prototyping version of the API. So you kind of do specification or at least a prototype first. Then you start showing it to people that, is this what you expect? Should we continue? So you use a lot of things in the method, like customer, API consumer interviews, and API audit checklist and other things which are lightweight, fast, and help you go from like nothing to something that looks like the API that you might be doing, but isn't really yet. And then you give leeway to the others, the API consumers, the testers, the UI specialists, other people around you that need to actually figure out what to do with the API when it's ready. And we used the minimum viable API architecture method here. So we took minimum viable architecture method, which is not very known, unfortunately, but it's like the only framework, the only thing, method that I've seen that actually answers to some of the problems that you have in agile projects. Because, of course, if you do a pure agile project, you don't have any time to do proper architecture. But you know you have to kind of do it anyways. You have to do some level of it. But what is the right level? So here we have the prototyping phase where you code very little or not at all. You mock stuff. Then you have the just enough that you can go to production. For example, in a project where I was working, we had this hard deadline. We had like 3-month project where we had to do 3 countries, APIs from scratch, and a web store. And we were so afraid because we had nothing. I mean, it was planned in a waterfall way. There were nothing in the culture, in the architecture that we could use. And we had one hard deadline, which was like the marketing campaign of the year was launched in March, and nothing could change that. Everything needed to be ready then. So we just had to do something. And of course, the scaling was the very difficult thing. I mean, we had to even scale everything in that 3 months. That's not ideal. Ideally, you look at what is the time frame where you can start with something, even if it's really brutal, if you know you have to recode it, reconfigure it and everything, but you know that the interfaces are not going to change that much. You can put small green men there and execute the stuff, but just do the just enough phase first. And then there's the problem that not everything goes as we saw in the previous presentation, that everything is designed beautifully and correctly and everything. This is real-world examples of the worst APIs ever that I've seen. Seriously, I found my husband one day in our bedroom, not doing what you think he was doing maybe, but the post-add and post-del APIs there. He's a network guy. He has never wanted to do anything API, but he had to because he had found out that AWS is actually kind of cool. And he wanted to do his first API. So what does he do? He goes and copy-pastes somebody's really, really bad APIs. And that's what he gets. And unfortunately, my husband is not the only copy-paste coder in the world. There are lots of others, because we all do it. I've done it. I confess to doing it, because sometimes it just seems like the fastest thing to do. But then you end up with, you know, basic authentication or sensitive information in your eyes, or you have this CRM system which has like 200 things in the database, attributes, and somebody says to you, well, API started with the CRUD operations. Just, you know, get, post, delete the 200 attributes there, that's just fine. And then you end up in an API world where you're afraid to change anything because it's just going to crash and nobody knows what to do with those 200 attributes. So all of these things happen because people do not have a method. There are lots of really, really good software developers out there and architects, but nobody has the same method. So then things happen like this. So you kind of like, Arnold was saying that if you don't have a purpose for your API, then it's going to be a terrible API. And that is seriously true, because the thing is that even if something looks very nice, works nicely, but then you have like an API management system, which was also a real-world situation, that we had 15 teams committing APIs and publishing them in one API management system. Everybody knew their stuff, but still all the publishings failed because they had not checked things in the design and implementation phase. That how does this need to be published there? Does it validate? Is the schema valid? Is the OpenAPI spec valid? Is there even an OpenAPI spec? Like a lot of things like that. And the status codes were, of course, always wrong. There was always that 200 OK, even if they were supposed to be REST APIs and all kind of nice things. But here, this is the kind of final problem. Everybody swears on DevOps. Who does DevOps here? Hands up. Well, probably almost everybody who codes something. I assume that the rest of you don't. So DevOps is something that everybody says that's really, really good thing. But it's not enough in the world of APIs, because you have two things that you kind of have to DevOps. You have the code that implements the API, but you also have the interface of the API. And they have different release cycles. You might change something in the implementation, but it actually doesn't change the interface that much, and vice versa. So you have to think about that. And if you have any kind of API gateway, API management there, or developer portal, documentation, you have to figure that out, because otherwise it doesn't work properly. Your API users are getting some interface that actually hasn't got anything to do with the reality. And then we have all this, the security stuff, the scalability stuff, the all kinds of data requirements and compliance issues. And I don't know about you, but when I studied computer science as a minor, we were taught that there are these nasty non-functional requirements. You had like, in the olden days, there were these Word documents that had like this many pages for all kinds of requirements, and nobody ever filled them up unless they really, really had to, because nobody even knew what to fill it up there. But we decided that because in agile projects, these NFRs are usually not even thought about that much until the code goes to production and something fails. So we made them look like, you know, coloring book pages, because the point of this is that you need to talk about this with the business. Unfortunately, IT sometimes needs to talk with the business, and if you ask somebody how many requests per minute your API is going to have, or like what is the scalability requirement, what is the rate limiting requirement, then nobody's going to know how to answer for a new API, because they don't know. I didn't know. I had to ask how many, you know, hammers and sauna stoves are we going to ship in this next month? And then I had to calculate how many API calls that's actually going to make. That's what's going to happen. And also those localization and internalization and network requirements and information architecture, data requirements, those are never done nowadays properly. You don't need to spend a lot of time there, but you do need to consider them with APIs. Then my couple of final points. So talking about business and talking to business, the first API I ever was involved with about 10 years ago, like REST-ish API. Guys came up to me and said, we want to make an API. And I was like, okay, what the heck is an API? I've heard of web services, I've done them, but what is an API? And well, then we did an API, but our salespeople didn't know what to do with it. They were afraid to talk about it to the customers because somebody might have actually asked them nasty questions. I was working with a US customer just this year, and they started out with saying that we have this API, we have had it for some time. The product manager of the API had a business goal that he needs to get users there, he needs to get revenue there from the API, but the sales guys didn't know how to explain the API to their customers, so nobody's using it. And we have to solve this. So if you don't have a clear sense of the purpose of the API, but a clear business model, clear value proposition for the API, then it's going to be ever that harder to explain after the API has already been made to anybody why they should be using it, who is it for. And that's why the APIOps cycles method contains also business model canvases, but it starts from value proposition canvas, which is very much used in product management, but it's an API version of it. And some of you, I know, I discussed over lunch, are using business model canvas for APIs, but it doesn't quite fit. It's useful, but there are things there that you need to know if you are working with APIs. The one clear thing there is that you can talk with the IT and the business on the same page and see that, okay, if this is going to cost us 10,000, then what's going to be the benefit? And that is sometimes missing from the internal discussions. And then there's also one more thing, which is that you need to figure out also how your customers are going to find your API. What does it look like to them? Who's actually going to make a decision in using the API, even if it's internal, but definitely if it's for partners or public API. And here are 4 examples. 2 of them on the top are banks, and one is Nordic. I assume that people in Sweden have heard of that, even if we hijacked it to Finland. But then there's Stripe, and then there's the Finnish Postal Services. And when we asked this question from product managers, like businessy people, they loved the Stripe, and they kind of liked the OP bank there. And Nordic was a bit confusing for everybody for some reason, even if they have spent a lot of time for it. But actually, the developers really loved the Posti API, and even the Posti people actually hate their API because it looks so bland and a lot of other reasons. But for developers, that was like the best ever. It looked like code, and it looked like you don't have to talk to sales to get in touch with the API. And like totally different things that you would expect if you were a designer or a business people. And that's what is wrong in a lot of APIs that I see, that there is a technical writer, there is a designer, there's a lot of these normal suspects when working with documentation or website design or something, and they are put there to describe the API, to do the API documentation. Or there's the lead developer who is writing the API documentation, and both are not optimal. So these are things that hopefully the method helps you with. And then the final thing, if you are interested, I have one open course there for APIs, like from quite basics, but we are planning to do APIOps cycles related courses. There are more, and I would really appreciate it if you signed up and let me know what kind of things you would like to see there. They're online courses. Thank you, guys. It was very nice to be here.